My first night as a temporary nanny in the Sterling mansion felt less like a job and more like a carefully locked prison. The house was too quiet, grand marble halls stretched endlessly, lit by cold golden chandeliers that cast no warmth. Every floorboard was polished to a mirror shine, every curtain perfectly draped, every surface spotless. Not a single sound of life echoed through the corridors, no chatter, no footsteps, no hum of appliances. Only a thick, suffocating stillness that pressed against my eardrums the second I stepped inside, and in the center of this lifeless luxury lay the reason I'd been hired, the Sterlings' only son. Their golden child, the richest family's most precious treasure in the entire city. Before I was even allowed to see him, the housekeeper pulled me aside. Her face blank and her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. She delivered one single, unbreakable rule that chilled me to the bone: you may watch him. You may soothe him with your voice. You may stay in the room all night. But do not touch the baby. Not a hand, not a finger, not even to wipe his tears. Break this rule, and you leave this house tonight with no references, no pay, and no future. I froze, confused and uneasy. I'd taken the last-minute nanny gig out of desperation. Rent was due, my savings were empty, and this temporary position paid absurdly well, enough to cover my bills 3 times over. The job description had seemed simple: overnight care for a sick infant. No special skills required, no experience threshold. Too good to be true. Now I knew why. Minutes later, I stood outside the nursery door and heard it for the first time, a small, broken, continuous cry. It was not the healthy, loud wail of a normal baby. It was thin, hoarse, exhausted, and endless. Woven into the house's oppressive silence like a warning point. 3 pediatric neurologists had already given their official, unanimous verdict before I arrived: rare neurological disorder. The child has been crying for 48 hours, refusing milk, unable to sleep, and jerking every few minutes. He needs to be transferred to a specialist unit immediately. A fatal, urgent diagnosis. A baby suffering non-stop, begging for medical help, yet the Sterlings had ignored every word that they'd sent every doctor away, refused hospital transfer, turned down every treatment plan, and instead hired a stranger, a temporary nanny, to sit and watch their sick child through the night with one cruel, forbidden order: do not touch. I stepped into the nursery, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was vast, elegant, and clinically sterile, far colder than any normal nursery. Silk-white curtains blocked all moonlight, leaving only dim, warm lamplight to spill over the oversized crib in the middle of the room. Inside lay the golden child. He was tiny, pale, and impossibly beautiful, with soft golden hair and delicate features that lived up to his family's obsession with perfection. But his body betrayed every ounce of that flawless appearance. Tears streamed nonstop down his chubby cheeks. His small shoulders shuddered with every broken cry. His little limbs twitched and jerked involuntarily every few seconds, sharp, sudden spasms that made him whimper harder. He turned his head frantically left and right, rejecting the bottle placed beside him, refusing every drop of milk. 48 hours without sleep. 48 hours without proper nourishment. 48 hours of unrelenting neurological pain. My chest ached violently at the sight. I'd cared for infants for years. I knew the signs. This baby was not just sick, he was suffering, deteriorating minute by minute, and he needed help. Human touch, comfort, warmth, professional medical intervention, everything his parents had deliberately denied him. The housekeeper stood in the doorway behind me, her tone sharp and final: no touching. No exceptions. The child's condition worsens with physical contact. The doctors failed to understand. The family knows best. With that, she pulled the nursery door closed with a soft click. I was locked inside alone with a dying baby and a terrifying rule: 4 hours. I sat on the chair by the crib, helpless, watching him cry and twitch, his tiny body growing weaker and weaker. His cries grew thinner, quieter, more broken, until they were barely audible whimpers. His spasms did not stop. His eyes stayed squeezed shut, flooded with endless tears. No parent checked in. No nurse arrived. No one came to soothe him, to medicate him, to save him. The richest family in the city could afford the best hospitals, the top specialists, endless medical care, but they chose to leave their sick child alone in a dark room, suffering in agony, banned from human touch. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I noticed something the doctors had completely missed. The baby's jerking spasms were not random, they were synchronized. Every twitch, every shudder, every broken movement matched a silent, invisible rhythm, like he was reacting to something in the room I could not see. And worse, the second I shifted forward, my hand hovering an inch above the crib, his suffering instantly eased, his cries softened, his spasms paused. His trembling body stilled. He needed me to touch him, but the family's deadly rule hung over my head, cold and unyielding. I had been warned. Touch the golden child, and I lose everything. Leave him untouched, and he would not survive the night. Midnight settled over the Sterling mansion like a heavy shroud, thick and airless. The entire estate remained dead silent, save for the faint, fragile whimpers of the baby trapped in the crib beside me. Outside the locked nursery door, no footsteps passed, no voices echoed, no signs of life stirred. It was as if the whole wealthy family had vanished, leaving only me and their suffering golden child behind. I sat frozen on the edge of the rigid armchair, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. My hand still hovered inches above the crib rail, trembling uncontrollably. The moment I'd leaned close, the baby's agonizing spasms had ceased entirely. His hoarse cries had faded to soft, sleepy breaths. And his tiny body relaxed for the first time in 48 hours. It was impossible. The neurologists had sworn his condition was a cruel, untreatable neurological disorder. They'd insisted only emergency hospital intervention could possibly save him. Physical contact should have done nothing, if not worsened his state. Just as the housekeeper had warned, but the proof was right in front of my eyes, the baby's long golden lashes fluttered, slowly lifting to reveal a pair of clear, quiet eyes. They were not clouded with pain or fever, not glassy from neurological damage. They were alert, sharp, and almost unnervingly conscious for a sick infant. He stared straight up at my hovering hand, as if he could feel my presence, my warmth, my hesitation. Tears still clung to his pale cheeks, but he no longer trembled. No more sudden jerking spasms racked his small frame. He was calm, unnaturally, impossibly calm. I pulled my hand back slightly, just a fraction, to test it. Instantly, the piece shattered. A violent spasm ripped through his body. His back arched sharply, his tiny hands clenched into tight fists, and a broken, shrill cry burst from his lips. The suffering returned in full force, brutal and unrelenting, as if my distant warmth had been the only thing holding his agony at bay. My blood turned cold. This was no disorder, this was a reaction. A desperate, primal reaction to being completely isolated from human touch. Confusion warred with panic in my chest. The Sterlings were the wealthiest family in the city. They had access to the best medical minds, the most advanced equipment, endless resources. If their child was suffering this badly, why refuse treatment? Why send doctors away? Why enforce this twisted, cruel rule of no contact? Curiosity overrode my fear, and I quietly rose from the chair, careful not to make a single loud sound. I scanned the vast, spotless nursery, searching for any clue, any explanation for the madness unfolding around me. The room was too perfect. Too empty. Too sterile. There were no stuffed toys, no soft blankets, no mobiles, no baby books, none of the warm, ordinary things that filled a normal infant's room. The only objects were the oversized white crib, a cold glass feeding bottle untouched for 2 days, and a single locked wooden cabinet tucked in the far corner of the wall. My gaze locked on that cabinet. Something about it felt wrong. Hidden. Secretive. I crossed the room slowly, my socks silent against the marble floor, and paused in front of the cabinet. The lock was small, old, and cheap, surprisingly flawed for a mansion filled with luxury and high-end security. With a tiny twist of my wrist, the weak lock clicked open. Inside were stacked old medical files, faded printed documents, and worn journal pages, all labeled with the same name, Sterling Infant Heir. My breath caught. I pulled out the top file and flipped it open, my eyes scanning the pages rapidly. What I read turned every assumption I'd had upside down, piece by terrifying piece. 3 years ago, the previous Sterling baby had suffered the exact same symptoms. Endless crying, refusal to eat, violent body spasms, sleepless agony. 3 top neurologists had given the exact same diagnosis, rare neurological disease. Like now, the family had refused hospitalization, refused treatment, refused all medical intervention, and then the baby had died overnight. My hands shook so hard the paper crinkled beneath my fingers. It was not a rare disorder. It was a pattern. A repeating, deadly pattern passed down to every Sterling golden child. Beneath the medical reports was a handwritten journal entry, penned in the matriarch's cold, looping handwriting. Dated 3 years prior. Touch poisons the air. Human warmth anchors the mortal curse. Isolation is the only protection. To hold the child is to kill the child. A curse. The Sterlings were not neglecting their child out of cruelty or arrogance. They were hiding behind a terrifying family legend, sacrificing their baby's comfort, health, and safety to ward off an invisible curse they believed would kill him faster than any disease. And the one thing that could soothe his suffering, the gentle human touch they banned, was the very thing they feared would destroy him entirely. A soft rustle from the crib snapped me back to the present. The baby was crying again, weaker now, his small body jerking erratically. His big, tearful eyes found mine across the room. And for a split second, I saw it, not sickness, not neurological damage, but pure, desperate loneliness. He was not dying from a disorder. He was dying from being unloved, untouched, and completely alone. The mansion's silence suddenly felt menacing. I knew the family was watching. Somewhere behind those locked doors, behind those perfect polished walls. They were monitoring every move I made, waiting to see if I would obey their deadly rule. If I touched him. They said he would die, but if I left him untouched, I knew for certain, he would not survive until dawn. The journal's words burned in my mind, sharp and unshakable. Touch poisons the air. Isolation is protection. The Sterlings had let their last infant die following this twisted belief. And now they were letting their new golden child wither away for the same reason. I closed the cabinet slowly, my fingers trembling against the chipped wood. The old papers felt cold, almost cursed in my grasp, carrying the ghost of the baby who'd perished alone in this very room 3 years ago. No disease. No bad genetics. Just fear. A generations-old family paranoia so extreme it bordered on madness. I turned back toward the crib, and my chest tightened painfully. The baby's spasms were growing worse by the minute. His tiny body convulsed in short, brutal bursts. His cries were no longer loud and frantic. They were thin, breathless whimpers, the sound of a child running out of strength. His golden hair was matted with cold sweat, his lips dry and pale from refusing milk for 2 full days. He was fading fast. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second pushing him closer to the same fate as the last Sterling heir. Midnight had long passed, and the mansion remained deathly silent. No one checked on him. No one cared enough to intervene. The family was content to wait out the night, trusting their cruel curse over their own bleeding child. I walked slowly back to the crib, every step heavy with dread. The rule echoed in my head, loud and threatening: do not touch him. If the family caught me breaking it, I would lose my job, my reputation, and every chance to fix this. They would kick me out instantly, leaving the baby to die alone. Worse, if their insane legend was true, my touch might trigger the very curse they feared, but watching him suffer any longer was impossible. I'd worked with infants long enough to know the difference between illness and despair. This baby wasn't sick. He was starving for contact, for warmth, for someone to hold him through the agony no medicine could cure. Human touch wasn't poisoning him. The lack of it was slowly killing him. I hesitated only a second longer, then I reached out and gently rested my palm over his tiny, trembling hand. The effect was instantaneous. His body stilled at once. The violent spasms ceased completely. His tight, clenched fists relaxed, curling weakly around my finger. The broken whimpers caught in his throat before melting into soft, steady breathing, for the first time in 48 hours. He looked peaceful, his tear-filled eyes fluttered open, locking onto mine, clear and calm. There was no pain, no confusion, no trace of the suffering that had consumed him. He simply stared at me, quiet and trusting, as if my single touch had anchored his fragile soul back to peace. Tears stung my eyes as I stroked the back of his tiny hand gently. The family was wrong. The curse was not in human touch. It was in their cold, endless abandonment. I stayed like that for a long while, my hand resting lightly on his, letting my warmth seep into his cold skin. His breathing steadied, his color returned, and he slowly drifted into a real, restful sleep, deep, natural, and free of torment. I'd never felt so relieved, yet so terrified, because the second he fell asleep, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible click from the nursery door. Someone was standing outside, watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. The mansion's silence turned sharp and dangerous. I'd been so focused on saving the baby that I'd forgotten I was being monitored every single second of the night. The door creaked open slowly. Mr. Sterling stood in the doorway, his tall frame shadowed by the hallway light, his face unreadable. The richest man in the city wore no emotion, no anger, no shock, no concern. His eyes were cold, dark, and calculating as they fixed on my hand resting on his son's skin. I froze completely. You touched him, he said flatly. It was not a question. It was a sentence. Behind him, the housekeeper appeared, her rigid face void of sympathy. I had broken the one rule they'd given me. I had defied the family's sacred, generations-old protection ritual. I lifted my hand slowly, ready to beg, to explain, to plead that the child was dying, that I'd saved him. But before I could speak a single word, Mr. Sterling stepped into the room and whispered a chilling truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. You don't understand, he said quietly. The curse isn't that touch kills him. It's that whoever touches him becomes the new sacrifice. The journal's words burned in my mind, sharp and unshakable. Touch poisons the air. Isolation is protection. The Sterlings had let their last infant die following this twisted belief. And now they were letting their new golden child wither away for the same reason. I closed the cabinet slowly, my fingers trembling against the chipped wood. The old papers felt cold, almost cursed in my grasp, carrying the ghost of the baby who'd perished alone in this very room 3 years ago. No disease. No bad genetics. Just fear. A generations-old family paranoia so extreme it bordered on madness. I turned back toward the crib, and my chest tightened painfully. The baby's spasms were growing worse by the minute. His tiny body convulsed in short, brutal bursts. His cries were no longer loud and frantic. They were thin, breathless whimpers, the sound of a child running out of strength. His golden hair was matted with cold sweat, his lips dry and pale from refusing milk for 2 full days. He was fading fast, the clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second pushing him closer to the same fate as the last sterling heir. Midnight had long passed, and the mansion remained deathly silent. No one checked on him. No one cared enough to intervene. The family was content to wait out the night, trusting their cruel curse over their own bleeding child. I walked slowly back to the crib, every step heavy with dread. The rule echoed in my head, loud and threatening: do not touch him. If the family caught me breaking it, I would lose my job, my reputation, and every chance to fix this. They would kick me out instantly, leaving the baby to die alone. Worse, if their insane legend was true, my touch might trigger the very curse they feared, but watching him suffer any longer was impossible. I'd worked with infants long enough to know the difference between illness and despair. This baby wasn't sick. He was starving for contact, for warmth, for someone to hold him through the agony no medicine could cure. Human touch wasn't poisoning him. The lack of it was slowly killing him. I hesitated only a second longer, then I reached out and gently rested my palm over his tiny, trembling hand. The effect was instantaneous, his body stilled at once. The violent spasms ceased completely. His tight, clenched fists relaxed, curling weakly around my finger. The broken whimpers caught in his throat before melting into soft, steady breathing, for the first time in 48 hours. He looked peaceful, his tear-filled eyes fluttered open, locking onto mine, clear and calm. There was no pain, no confusion, no trace of the suffering that had consumed him. He simply stared at me, quiet and trusting, as if my single touch had anchored his fragile soul back to peace. Tears stung my eyes as I stroked the back of his tiny hand gently. The family was wrong. The curse was not in human touch. It was in their cold, endless abandonment. I stayed like that for a long while, my hand resting lightly on his, letting my warmth seep into his cold skin. His breathing steadied, his color returned, and he slowly drifted into a real, restful sleep, deep, natural, and free of torment. I'd never felt so relieved, yet so terrified, because the second he fell asleep, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible click from the nursery door. Someone was standing outside, watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. The mansion's silence turned sharp and dangerous. I'd been so focused on saving the baby that I'd forgotten I was being monitored every single second of the night. The door creaked open slowly. Mr. Sterling stood in the doorway, his tall frame shadowed by the hallway light, his face unreadable. The richest man in the city wore no emotion, no anger, no shock, no concern. His eyes were cold, dark, and calculating as they fixed on my hand resting on his son's skin. I froze completely. You touched him, he said flatly. It was not a question. It was a sentence. Behind him, the housekeeper appeared, her rigid face void of sympathy. I had broken the one rule they'd given me. I had defied the family's sacred, generations-old protection ritual. I lifted my hand slowly, ready to beg, to explain, to plead that the child was dying, that I'd saved him. But before I could speak a single word, Mr. Sterling stepped into the room and whispered a chilling truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. You don't understand, he said quietly. The curse isn't that touch kills him. It's that whoever touches him becomes the new sacrifice. The words hung thick in the frigid nursery air, sharp enough to slice through every ounce of relief I'd just felt. Whoever touches him becomes the new sacrifice. My breath caught hard in my throat, and I instinctively yanked my hand away from the sleeping baby's tiny fingers. It was too late. The moment my skin lost contact with his, a strange, burning numbness exploded across my palm. It crept upward, crawling along my veins like frozen poison, spreading slow and relentless toward my wrist, my forearm, my elbow. It was not pain exactly, it was emptier, colder, wronger, like something invisible had latched itself to my body and begun feeding on my warmth. I stared down at my skin. There were no marks, no bruises, no scars. To any normal eye, I looked unharmed. But I could feel it clearly. A foreign weight nestled inside me, dormant no longer. The baby stirred in his crib, without my touch anchoring him. The faint peace he clung to dissolved instantly. His small shoulders twitched. His brows crumpled. A soft, whimpering cry trembled past his lips, the same suffering I'd worked so hard to quiet. Yet his spasms were mild now, dulled. As if the curse that had tormented him for 48 hours had finally abandoned its old host, and latched onto me instead. I stumbled backward until my hips hit the wall, my gaze darting wildly between my tingling arm and Mr. Sterling's unyielding stare. What does it do? I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best effort to stay steady. What sacrifice? Mr. Sterling stepped further into the room, his expensive shoes silent against the marble floor. There was no malice in his expression, only a bone-deep weariness, the exhaustion of a man who'd guarded a family nightmare for far too long. The curse belongs to the Sterling bloodline, he said calmly. It binds itself to every heir at birth. It feeds on warmth, on human connection. Trapped inside the child, it starves. That is why he convulses, why he screams without cease, why he rejects all comfort. It is not sickness. It is hunger. My blood ran cold. For generations, we kept it contained through isolation, he continued. No touch, no warmth, no bond. The curse weakens. The child survives. But anyone who chooses to hold him, to soothe him, to give it the warmth it craves, trades places. The housekeeper spoke again, her tone flat and final. Reciting a truth they'd memorized through decades of loss, the child's pain transfers to the toucher. His suffering becomes yours. His death becomes yours. I flexed my fingers, and the numb burning flared sharper, making me gasp quietly. Already, my vision swam at the edges. A faint, constant tremor settled in my bones, mirroring exactly the baby's earlier spasms. The longer I stood there, the more I understood. Every twitch he'd endured was now mine to carry. The last nanny, Mr. Sterling said softly, also thought she was saving him. She held him through the night, just like you. By 3 a.m., she began convulsing. By dawn, she was gone. I stared at the sleeping golden child. He looked angelic now, peaceful and untroubled, his breathing soft and even. The agony that had tortured him for 2 days and 2 nights was completely gone. He was free. And I was dying in his place. Rage and terror tangled violently in my chest. You knew this would happen, I accused, my voice cracking. You let me walk in here blind. You let me save him knowing I'd take his curse. Mr. Sterling's jaw tightened, the only sign of emotion he allowed himself. We have no other choice, he replied quietly. The curse cannot die with the child. If it starves too long, it consumes the heir entirely. We lose our bloodline. Our name ends. For 3 years, our son suffered endlessly so our family could survive. Last night, he was on the brink of destruction. We needed someone to take its place. Someone like me. A temporary nanny. A stranger. Disposable. The realization crashed over me like ice water. I hadn't been hired to care for the baby. I'd been hired to be the sacrifice. A sudden, sharp jolt ripped through my body, violent, involuntary, identical to the baby's worst spasms. My knees buckled, and I barely caught myself on the wall, a quiet cry tearing from my lips. The curse was waking fully inside me. Through my blurred vision, I saw the baby stir again. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked straight at me. This time, there was no innocence in his gaze, there was recognition. Relief. And a tiny, cold, knowing smile. The sacrifice had been accepted. My body seized again, a brutal, jerking spasm that racked my shoulders and sent my vision spinning. The cold, burning numbness surged through my veins, settling deep in my bones. It was the exact torment the baby had endured for 48 hours, endless. Unrelenting, inescapable. I pressed my forehead against the cold marble wall. Gasping for air, my fingers scraping against the smooth stone in a desperate attempt to ground myself. Panic bubbled in my throat, sharp and bitter. The Sterlings had lured me here under false pretenses, traded my life for their heirs, and watched me fall for their trap without a single shred of guilt. You think this is over? I gritted out, my voice hoarse and trembling. Another tremor ripped through my limbs, stealing my balance for a split second. You think I'll just die quietly for your family's legacy? Mr. Sterling's expression remained impassive, his gaze cold and unyielding. There is no reversal. The curse binds instantly. You will grow weaker with every passing hour. Before the sun rises, you will fade. The curse will settle dormant once more inside our bloodline, and my son will live. He spoke of my death like a simple transaction, a necessary price to preserve his family's name and fortune. The housekeeper stood rigid in the doorway, silent and unblinking, as if she'd watched this sacrifice play out dozens of times before. I lifted my shaking head. My eyes locking onto the crib behind them. The golden baby was awake now. He lay perfectly still, no longer whimpering, no longer twitching. His big eyes stayed fixed on me, dark and knowing, that tiny, unnatural smile still playing on his soft lips. There was no fear, no confusion, no childlike innocence left in his stare. Only quiet satisfaction. In that moment, a horrifying, unspoken truth clicked into place in my fractured mind. The Sterlings were wrong. They'd misunderstood their own family curse for generations. They believed the affliction clung to their bloodline. That it starved in isolation, that it forced the heir to suffer until a stranger's touch transferred the pain away. But that was not what I felt burning inside me. This curse was not a burden tied to their blood. It was a parasite. A greedy, sentient thing that dwelled inside the Sterling children, feeding on their suffering until it found a warmer, livelier host to devour entirely. It did not settle dormant. It traded a weak, starving vessel for a healthy, vibrant one. And the baby, this perfect, angelic child, knew exactly what he was doing. He had not been a helpless victim all these years. He had been a bait. I pushed off the wall, ignoring the violent tremors shaking my body. My steps unsteady but deliberate. Mr. Sterling's brows lifted slightly, surprised by my defiance. Expecting me to crumble into fear and helplessness like the nannies before me. Stop walking, he warned. his tone sharpening for the first time all night. Any further contact with him will only accelerate the curse. A bitter, breathless laugh escaped my lips. You don't understand a thing about your own curse, I whispered. I kept moving forward, ignoring the burning poison spreading through my chest, until I stood directly beside the crib. The baby's smile widened, soft and sweet, utterly deceptive. He lifted his tiny hand, reaching for me, begging for another touch, craving more warmth to feed the parasite inside him. Mr. Sterling moved to grab me, to yank me back before I doomed myself further, but I twisted away, my gaze never leaving the child's knowing eyes. They all feared touching him, feared the transfer of pain and death. But no one had ever dared to ask what happened if the new host refused to die. What happened if you took the power back? I hovered my hand over his small chest, the curse inside me flaring violently, screaming in protest. My vision blurred, my knees threatened to give out. But I locked every muscle in my body and held firm. You've been feeding on other people's lives long enough, I murmured to the baby. The smile faded from his face in an instant, his calm, angelic features twisted. A sharp, shrill cry burst from his mouth, not the weak, suffering whimpers of before, but an angry, terrified shriek. His body convulsed violently, far worse than any spasm he'd endured in the past 48 hours. Panic flashed across Mr. Sterling's face. He lunged forward, horrified. What are you doing? Stop. It was too late. The curse was never one way, and I was no longer the disposable sacrifice they'd hoped for. Panic shattered Mr. Sterling's icy composure the second the baby's shrill scream tore through the quiet nursery. The child's perfect, peaceful facade crumbled completely. His tiny body arched off the crib mattress, racking with convulsions far more brutal than any he'd suffered in the past 2 days. His golden hair clung to his sweat-slick forehead, his eyes squeezed tight. And his cries were no longer the weak whimpers of a suffering infant, they were raw, terrified shrieks of something ancient and parasitic. Fighting for its life, the housekeeper froze mid-step, her rigid posture crumbling. She stared at the crib in undisguised horror, witnessing a sight no Sterling servant had ever dared to imagine. I stood unyielding beside the crib, every muscle in my body trembling, my vision swimming with black spots. The curse burning in my veins raged violently, screaming to break free. The cold numbness spread to my chest, making every breath shallow and labored, but I refused to fall. I refused to be their disposable sacrifice. Mr. Sterling lunged forward, his voice sharp and desperate, stripped of all its calm indifference. Stop it. What are you doing? You'll kill him. I'm just giving back what belongs to your bloodline, I gasped out, my throat burning. You said the curse trades hosts. You thought it was a one-way bargain, stranger for heir. But no one told you the curse can be returned. For generations, the Sterlings had been fools. They believed their isolated suffering was protection, that feeding the curse a stranger's warmth would secure their child's safety forever. They never realized the parasite was loyal to nothing but its own survival. It latched onto the warmest, strongest host available, and right now, I was forcing it to choose. I pressed my palm lightly to the baby's trembling chest. The contact ignited a violent, invisible clash of energy in the room. A searing heat burst from my hand, rippling through the child's small body. The curse inside me howled, a silent, torturous roar, tearing through my veins as I forced every ounce of the borrowed suffering, every fragment of the parasitic burden, backward across our skin. The spasms racking my body stopped instantly, the burning numbness in my limbs vanished. The fog in my vision cleared. The death sentence hanging over me shattered completely, and the baby's agony exploded tenfold. He screamed until his voice went hoarse and broken. His tiny hands flailed wildly, his body convulsing so violently the crib rattled against the marble floor. The knowing, cold glint in his eyes was gone, replaced by pure, primal terror. He was no longer the clever, hidden predator hiding behind an innocent face. He was just a child again, trapped, overwhelmed, and drowning under the full weight of the Sterling curse his family had spent decades shielding him from. This is impossible, Mr. Sterling whispered, his face draining of all color. He stumbled backward, staring at his son in stunned disbelief. The curse never goes back. It never leaves a new host. Because no one ever fought it, I said steadily, stepping away from the crib. My voice was weak, but unshakable. All the nannies before me panicked. They grieved. They surrendered and died. They let the curse consume them. I didn't. I'd realized the truth too late to save myself at first, but not too late to reverse it. The curse fed on passivity, on fear, on helpless sacrifice. When its new host resisted, when they fought to reclaim their life, the fragile transfer broke apart. The housekeeper's hands flew to her mouth, her unbreakable stoicism finally crumbling. She'd witnessed countless sacrifices, watched endless strangers die for the Sterling heir. But she had never seen anyone flip the curse's deadly bargain. The baby's screams softened into broken, exhausted whimpers. His body stilled, trembling violently, and he stared up at his father with tear-filled, terrified eyes. The cold, unnatural intelligence was gone. All that remained was a fragile, overstimulated infant, crushed under the burden his bloodline was born to carry. The curse was home. It was no longer hiding in a stranger's body. No longer feeding on innocent warmth. It was trapped exactly where the Sterling's twisted legacy had always meant for it to be, bound to their golden heir. Bound to their blood, bound to the endless suffering they'd tried to outrun. I straightened my shoulders, brushing the lingering tremor from my hands, and met Mr. Sterling's devastated gaze. "You hired me to die for your son," I said quietly. "Now your son gets to carry his own curse." He stared at me, defeated and hollow, no longer the cold, untouchable patriarch of the city's wealthiest family. All his careful planning, all his generations of sacrifice and cruelty, had unraveled in a single night. The nursery fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, save for the baby's soft, suffering whimpers. I turned toward the door, ready to leave this cursed mansion behind me for good, but before I could take a single step, Mr. Sterling's low, desperate voice stopped me cold. "Wait," he said, raw and broken. "It's not over. The curse always demands a sacrifice. If it didn't take you, it will take us." Mr. Sterling's desperate words hung thick in the icy nursery air, halting every step I took toward the door. "The curse demands a sacrifice." My skin crawled with residual unease, the last faint tingle of the parasitic curse still lingering beneath my surface. I'd reversed the transfer, forced the torment back into the golden child where it belonged, but his frantic, broken whimpers echoed proof that nothing was truly over. I turned slowly, my gaze locking on the shattered patriarch of the Sterling family. His cold, unbreakable composure was gone, replaced by raw, primal fear, the same fear he'd forced countless strangers to endure for generations. "What do you mean, it will take you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the quiet dread coiling in my stomach. He swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping in defeat, a vulnerable man finally unmasked after decades of cruel control. The housekeeper beside him trembled, her rigid professionalism crumbling completely, as if she'd spent years dreading this exact moment. "The curse has ancient rules," Mr. Sterling muttered, his tone hollow and defeated. "It was bound to our bloodline by a bargain. Every generation, it feeds once. If it fails to claim an outsider's life, if the sacrifice is rejected or returned, it hunts the source of its bondage. It hunts the Sterling blood." My breath caught. Pieces of the twisted family history clicked together at last. They hadn't isolated their children out of blind superstition. They'd built that cruel, loveless rule out of terror. They'd known the curse would turn on them if it didn't get its outsider sacrifice. Every band touch, every suffering night, every disposable nanny they'd hired had all been a shield to protect their own lives. Not their child's. The baby's shrill cries softened into weak, gasping whimpers. His violent convulsions slowed, not because he was healing, but because the curse was shifting again, restless, rejected, and searching for its true, promised prey. A cold wind swept through the sealed nursery, though the windows were locked tight. The lamplight flickered wildly, casting jagged, dancing shadows across the marble walls. The air turned thin, suffocating, charged with an invisible fury. "It's waking up," the housekeeper whispered shakily. "It's no longer bound to the child. It's coming for the family." Panic flashed across Mr. Sterling's face. He spun toward the crib, reaching for his son for the first time all night. Desperate to cradle the child he'd sacrificed so much to protect, but before his fingers could brush the baby's skin, a brutal, invisible force slammed into his chest. He doubled over with a ragged gasp, his body seizing in a violent spasm, identical to the ones the baby had endured, identical to the ones I'd carried mere minutes ago. His knuckles whitened as he clutched his chest, his face draining to a deathly pale shade. "Father." The housekeeper lunged to steady him, but she froze mid-movement, her eyes widening in horror. Another spasm racked Mr. Sterling's frame, harder than the last. He stumbled backward, crashing into the wall, his breathing ragged and broken. The curse had abandoned its child host entirely. It had found its rightful payment, the man who'd forged the bargain, the man who'd spent generations cheating its sacrifice. "This is the reckoning," he coughed out, his voice cracking. "I knew it would come. I just hoped I could outrun it long enough to protect my blood." I watched him suffer, no pity stirring in my chest. For years, he'd let innocent strangers die in his place. For years, he'd locked his own child in loveless isolation, weaponizing an infant's suffering to save himself. Now he was finally tasting the endless agony he'd traded away. The baby in the crib fell completely silent. No cries, no whimpers, no tremors. He lay calm and still once more, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. The parasitic curse was gone from his body, drained away to torment the father who'd manipulated its rules for decades, and as I stared down at him, I saw it again, that faint, knowing smile tugging at his lips. He had known. All along, he had understood the curse's rules better than his own parents. He'd endured endless nights of agony, letting the family fool themselves into thinking he was the helpless victim, waiting for the day someone finally broke their cycle of sacrifice. waiting for the day the curse turned home. Mr. Sterling's spasms grew more violent by the second. He sank to his knees on the cold marble floor, his body trembling uncontrollably, his vision fading fast. Please, he gasped, lifting a shaking hand toward me. Help me. Reverse it again. I'll pay you anything, money, houses, everything. Just stop this. I stared down at his broken, desperate form, my heart cold and unyielding. You told me the curse has no reversal, I said quietly. You told me every sacrifice is final. The rules he'd lived by, the cruel bargain he'd hidden behind his family's wealth and power, could not be rewritten now that they worked against him. The lamplight steadied at last. The cold wind died. The nursery fell into a heavy, final silence. The curse had its sacrifice. I stepped past the kneeling, suffering man, past the frozen housekeeper, toward the nursery door. My body was light, free of the poison that had once doomed me. I was alive. As my hand touched the doorknob, I glanced back one last time. The golden child stared straight at me, his perfect, innocent face unmarred by pain. And in his clear, bright eyes, I saw the terrible truth no one in the Sterling family had ever realized. The curse was never their punishment. It was their son's weapon.